Well, at some point, the buck stops at what is the highest value. And this is important. And this is what Pageau talks about this, is that thing that sits at the highest value acts as an organizing principle for every value underneath it. And if it's that aim and that organizing principle that's controlling what you see or don't see, that means the highest value in your system acts as an idol. It is like your God. And so if God is not at the top, then you have, by definition, an idol guiding your life. And if it's an idol guiding your life who does not care about you, it will destroy you just so it can be around or be alive or have its moment in the sun, right? But to be guided by an idol is to have 100% of your relevance realization, your perceptions, tyrannized and askewed by that idol. Josh, you mentioned addiction. What a great example of something that can tyrannize your perceptions, right? You can talk to a brilliant person who is a drug addict, and they can give you the most complex, amazing, logical progression to how to look, find, and source drugs and why they need them and why all of the people talking to them don't understand what it's like. Because the addiction has tyrannized the relevance realization. They cannot even see how it's relevant outside the review because they're blind to it. This is why the facts don't get you there, because the facts don't shine forth. What you need is a different story to highlight the relevant facts differently. And so you come all the way back to, it's the gospel that's the power of God unto salvation, the story of how Jesus Christ became king. This is what people need to hear in the world today. And especially in the modern Western world with all of the technology and all of the platform and all of the narratives being pumped into everybody's palm every day through their phone. Now you have these things. And again, it's not infinite, but it's not finite like climate change. Something like a finite story because you imagine there's a solution, but it's kind of also like an infinite story because everybody kind of has to get on board or we're never going to get there. And in that gray area without clarity, it's where they operate. They operate in the gray because in the gray, you don't exactly know what you're aiming at. So they can come in and give you a ordering principle for your life for you to participate in. And it explains then this idolatrous tyranny over your life, over your choices. It does not care about you like Christ does. For any of these major initiatives, you're just a mouthpiece for them to advance their agenda. Whereas for Christ, he's actually coming to build you into the person God wants you to be. And that person is communal and loving. And so there's this big difference.
You talked about in the infinite story, the finite story, and the gray area. The gray area is not only, I think, Satan's favorite playground because it gives us the aptitude for moral gratification, but doesn't give us any of its actual telos, right? Where you're not in a trajectory. That's why it's finite, is because the trajectory is not leading you upward. Forgive me for loving poetry, but there's a band that I love called My Epic. They said, there's 1,000 joys that show me home, but never let me stay. And those are the kind of things that, as you notice, there are things, like you said, that are worthwhile goals that are from before me, they'll be after me. And for all practical purposes in relation to my life, it's an infinite, as in unending, I'll end first kind of game. That does not mean that it is the eternal trajectory that it sometimes fronts itself to be. It needs to be baptized and nested into the actual infinite story in order to participate properly in being that trajectory. And so if it's not integrated and nested into that actual infinite story, then it ceases to be the springboard by which that you go from glory to glory, as you said earlier. In relation to eternity, those are all finite games. But in relation to one's own life, they seem unending. And so we are willing to kind of give them our attention and our allegiance and participate in them because they do, in the long run, seem to be very worthwhile. I'm reminded of, let's say, some of the stories that people would tell about the explorer going across the ocean and finding a new land, and so forth, and the exploration and the pioneer narrative that kind of recurs itself in many different stories, not only from actual historical stories like Lois and Clark, but also things like Star Trek. And yet inside both of them, you kind of have the sneaking suspicion that noticing one side of the story is not enough. If you notice both sides of a pioneer myth or an explorer myth, what you actually have is the other half of that is conquest and the loss of the other. The person who's already inhabiting that newfound land, their narrative and experience is going to be quite contrasted from the pioneer's contrast, right? And so those two polar opposite experiences happening in the same narrative is why a pioneer myth is not the one. It's not the narrative. You participate in it and it can have it's a good thing, but it has to be nested in something else, or you'll become a tyrant conqueror. This is the same thing as like a marriage, right? As a man, I have a wife. A perfect wife is perfectly submitted, and a perfect man is perfectly guiding and loving and protecting. Since neither of us are perfect, there's an imbalance that kind of naturally occurs, right? But in order to have submission that is not slavery and leadership that is not tyranny, both stories need to be in the same place for the same reason. I don't get to be the leader if she does not submit, and she does not submit if I am not a leader. And that's why it's the feedback loop that it is. That's why it becomes a trajectory. That's one of the reasons why it works so well.
It's not that these things aren't good. It's that they've been misordered. And because they're misordered, they misappropriate more than they should. Goods taken out of order tyrannize and destroy. And that's the important thing. Whereas what Josh was saying is that when they're rightly integrated in the proper aim, that can actually afford that integration. See, when you have tyrant through an idol, you can't afford integration across the infinite set of things that exist in the world. But with the right one, you can. You can rightly integrate and conquer, not in a way that leaves it behind an assault of the earth kind of dust format, but more of like in the way what we see in the history of the church is it went forth and conquered various areas and cultures. Doesn't destroy it and replace it, integrates, transforms, and offers back to God something beautiful.